Well, Richard, thank you so much. Lots to think about there. And as I mentioned at the start to everyone, and welcome, by the way, if you arrived since we began. It's really good to have you all with us. As I mentioned at the start, we've got plenty of time now for a Q&A. So what Professor Buggs was just speaking about may well have raised questions, perhaps about some of the science of it, or perhaps about how it connects to faith and a belief in God. So feel free to ask questions. I'm just going to check the chat. Doesn't look like any have come in yet on the chat. So do type away if you've got anything that you'd like to ask, or if you prefer to just unmute yourself. I think we're a reasonable enough number to invite you just to do that. Unmute yourself and maybe give us a wave so we know that you're the one with a question, and we'll try to give way to you. So do go ahead and ask any questions. Mark Taylor, yeah, thank you.
So thanks for that. That's really helpful. So I guess I'm a physicist rather than a biologist, but the arguments are often the same, which is, I look at the world and I think, how can you look at the world and not believe there was some sort of intelligent creator? How can that be the case? And what I've come to realize after a while is that basically people believe what they want to believe. So if you're minded to be, you don't have to be an atheist, but you don't want to be a Christian, you're going to look at the same set of scientific data, or you're going to look at the same results, and essentially they'll fit your world view, or your view of the world, and you'll kind of shoehorn them into doing it, which is kind of what Dawkins has done, right? He set his stall out. I'm an atheist. I need the evidence to support it, so I'll make ridiculous assumptions about probability so that it kind of holds together. And so, as a Christian, I've kind of backed off the trying to hit people hard, but seriously, how can you possibly look at this and not be a Christian? Because I think it comes down to people's hearts, and I'm wondering how do we? The other extreme is just to go, okay, we won't say anything at all. We'll just pray. I mean, we should definitely pray. But is there something in between where God's given us brains and made us intelligent and let us view the world and see its complexity and appreciate it, and yet we want people to believe in Him? Is there some kind of way of both prayerfully but lovingly presenting what you presented? For instance, just now, if you over time speaking to people, rather than just hitting them with the hard, you're making ridiculous assumptions, don't be daft. Is there some nuance on that, or what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. People look at the evidence with prior beliefs. We all have prior beliefs, and whenever we look at evidence for something, we're weighing it against that prior. So, if, for example, I am utterly convinced I am on an Arctic island that has no human beings on it, but I see a snowman. If I'm so sure that there are no other humans there, then I have to believe it came about by chance. However, if my prior is 99% sure that there are no humans there, but 1% maybe there are, then if I see a complex snowman, probably I'm going to allow that evidence to push me towards believing. And even if I don't immediately believe there are other humans there, my prior now might be 50-50. And so if I then see a chainsaw or something like that, then that will push me all the way to belief. And I think what you're saying is absolutely right. Some people, their prior on God's existence is 0. And so whatever evidence comes their way, they just will not take that seriously. I think David Hume said, if my best friend, who had always told me the truth before, came and told me that he'd seen a man rising from the dead, I would just believe that he was mistaken, that he had been deceived. And even if I saw it myself, even though my senses have always been reliable, I would just assume I must be mistaken, because his prior was 0 on these things. And I agree with you. We meet many people whose prior on God's existence is 0. And so whatever we say, it won't shift them. But I think the good news is many people haven't really realized that they're being driven by that presupposition. I think many people think they have followed the evidence, and they've been given the evidence in a very biased way by other people whose prior on God's existence is 0. But if we go through the evidence with them, they might realize, actually, I thought evidence was driving me to atheism, but actually maybe it isn't. Maybe it is my presuppositions. And so I think, if you like, everyone thinks that they're an evidentialist, but actually they're a presuppositionalist. But we probably need the evidence to prove to them they are a presuppositionalist, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, and I think, maybe so being an agent to change and not necessarily having to implement the entire change is part of our role. And if we can move them from 10 to 15%, then we've done something loving and something good for them.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mark. Interesting question from a kind of Christian perspective. Any questions welcome if they're, from that kind of perspective as well, of belief, or from a different perspective if you're not sure about belief in a God or anything like that yet. So feel free to keep the questions coming. Okay, Richard, the question just come up in the chat, which you may have seen. Thank you for this interesting talk from Holly. What are your views on how to interpret Genesis 1 in the context of evolution?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think we have to be clear. This is a very different question than the question of God's existence. So I think that the natural world gives a lot of evidence for God's existence in the sort of terms that I've been describing. And I think if we want to think biblically about this, if as a Christian we want to let the Bible sort of guide our thinking, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does the Bible say someone should be able to work out about God without the Bible? If someone is just looking at the natural world, what could we expect them to understand? And I think the answer is God's eternal power and glory. That's in Romans. That without revelation from the Bible, people should be able to see God's eternal power and glory. In other words, they should be able to see that he is, that he exists and is a very intelligent agent. What the Bible doesn't say to us is that without the Bible, we would be able to know everything that's in the Bible, including some of the things the Bible says about history. So, for example, the resurrection. The Bible doesn't claim that without the Bible we could tell that the resurrection had happened. I can look at the atoms around me all I like, and it's not going to tell me the resurrection happened. And so we have to bear in mind that what the Bible is saying in Genesis won't necessarily show up in science. Even though we might want it to. So that's one thing to bear in mind. That would be my first point. The other thing I'd say is Christians over the ages have interpreted Genesis 1 in very different ways, and I don't think any of those ways sort of ruled someone out from being a Christian. Some people have seen it as the days are different ages. Some see the days as a more poetic thing. Some see them as a literal 24 hours. And I think all of those beliefs, in my view, are compatible with being a Christian. I wouldn't say to someone, you're not a Christian because of this belief or because of this belief. I'm probably straying more onto Johnny's ground than my own when I say this. But I think we have to bear that in mind. But this is my view. And feel free to disagree, Johnny, if you want to, and I'd respect that. But I think this gives us great liberty to think as Christians. And I think we, in some ways, are more able to follow the evidence where it leads than an atheist is. Because I can look at my science, and I know Christians who basically believe everything evolved pretty much as Richard Dawkins says it did, with the occasional tweak from God, done in a way that was imperceptible, just invisibly sort of guiding things, but in a way that can't be detected. I know other Christians who think that God created basically every species by a divine intervention. So as a scientist, I can look at the evidence, and any one of them will fit basically within a Christian worldview, an evangelical Christian worldview. If I'm an atheist, though, only one of them works for me. I have to believe that all of this came about by a natural, purposeless, blind process. And then the only option on the table is the Darwinian mechanism plus chance. And so I don't have a great deal of freedom of thought. You know, even if the evidence points me somewhere different, I'm still going to be, I still basically only have one option. And so in some ways, I would argue that Christians can be more open-minded than an atheist can. And in some ways, that makes us better scientists, not worse scientists. I think people often think that is the other way around. So how do I think everything fits together with Genesis 1? I have to say, I don't really know. That's a vast subject. To really answer that question, you'd have to understand a great deal about the science and a great deal about the Bible. And I know that saying I don't know is something that scientists find difficult to say, and I know it's something that Christians find difficult to say as well. But I think sometimes we just have to be honest and say I don't really know how that all fits together.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And there's lots of helpful stuff in that response. And just to mention as well, another resource that might be helpful to people is Andy, our senior minister here tonight. He actually preached through the early chapters of Genesis a little while ago and spent a lot of time grappling with the text there and what it means and what it was meant to communicate and what it wasn't meant to communicate and that sort of thing. So do have a look at our church website, and those talks are there from Genesis 1 to 3. Andy, do you want to give a little snapshot on that now, or just point people to them?
Yeah, I think those talks be helpful because I elaborate on. I think I agree with Richard in many respects, but genre's we've got to just understand the genre of the text. And again, Christians disagree about this. It's not a huge thing, but I think the genre in Genesis 1 is surely different to the genre of Genesis 2 onwards, and I think you see that even within the account. So the book of Genesis is broken up by all these sort of chapter markers, essentially, where it's told this is the generation of, this is the generation of, this is the generation of. And if you're reading through Genesis, you'll notice those markers which introduce the next bit of history, and it seems to indicate that Genesis is compiled of sources. And it's striking that Genesis 1 doesn't begin with this is the generation of, unlike the rest of it. And even as you read it, it looks like a different sort of genre. So my own view on Genesis 1 is it's not presenting a history, but a theology. And it's trying to give us the theological undergirding, which assumptions into which the rest of the historical account can take place. So I elaborate there more in those talks, which might be helpful. This is, something which I've managed to think a bit about over the years, but I'm not a scientist. That's all.
Thanks, Andy. Great. So do check them out on the website or on the podcast. Another helpful podcast, by the way, is it's called Knowing Faith, which looks a bit like that. And they've had a few episodes recently on this sort of topic. Okay, so just going through the questions that have come up in order. One from Connor here. Why do you think the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs? And where do they come in the timeline of creation and humans? Have you thought about that, Richard?
Well, I think this is basically the same question as the previous one. So I'd answer that in pretty much the same way.
Yeah. So in terms of creation and what's created and why and how those questions interact, point you to the same sort of things really on what Genesis is trying to communicate and how it does so. Okay, a slightly different question here from Tom and Joe. If God has perfectly designed everything, then why do we get mistakes like heart defects?
Yeah, I agree. That's many of us have bodies which are not perfect, myself very much included. And we have to remember that as well as telling us that God is creator in a way that seems to fit with natural world evidence that we are the product of design. Romans particularly also tells us that this is a decaying world, a world where stuff is going wrong and has gone wrong. And many mutations are, of course, harmful. And we're not perfect. And so that's why we have things like heart defects. This is why we have things like COVID. This is why we have cancer. We're living in an imperfect world, but looking forward to one in which perfection will be restored.
Yeah, thank you. And that, I guess, connects to that other question as well about suffering. A lot of people at Evolution explain suffering in a way that's easier to stomach, e.g. cancer is just a mutation of cells, not a person's design. How do you respond to this? I guess in the same sort of way, really.
Well, I'm not sure that evolution does make it easier to stomach, because if Dawkins is right, then suffering has no meaning at all. The universe is blind to your suffering. If you have cancer, the universe doesn't care. You've just been unlucky. You're being selected against by natural selection. It has no meaning at all. Whereas from a Christian perspective, suffering has huge meaning, and it does have a purpose. And so to my mind, that makes suffering actually much easier to cope with than the highly unsympathetic view that, you've just been unlucky, it doesn't matter, your life doesn't matter, you are just a collection of atoms, and the universe does not care. So when I face suffering, I certainly find theism, and particularly Christian theism, very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. For what it's worth, that question of suffering we're going to focus on in more detail in a few weeks as well. Question from Louise, or Tom by the looks of the screen. Is evolution incompatible with the idea that the whole human race is physically descended from two people?
No. So some people have said, well, the genetic diversity of the human race is so large that we simply cannot have come from just two individuals. And on the face of it, that sounds very plausible. How could two individuals give rise to such a diverse race of human beings? But actually, within two human beings, you can carry a massive amount of genetic variation, because we each carry two genomes, one from our mum, one from our dad. And so in a couple, you've got four genomes. And DNA is encoded in just four letters that we often refer to as A, T, G, and C. And so at any point in the genome, all four of those possibilities can be present in a single couple. So a single couple could carry within them all of the single nucleotide variation that is found in the whole human race today, which is mind-blowing, but that's an amazing aspect of how the genetic code works. So no, it is possible to believe that the human race did come from a single couple, but is as diverse as it is today.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I think there's some evolutionists who are also Christians who would say that maybe what the Bible is teaching is that Adam and Eve were sort of spiritually the first humans, rather than literally created before the rest of the human race. And I'm just wondering if we believe that they were created before anyone else in a physical sense, is that problematic in terms of evolutionary theory, in a way that the other sort of way of fitting it together wouldn't be?
This is a slightly different issue, because the issue of is it possible that current day genetic diversity could have come from a single couple? That question is detached from the question of where that single couple came from. So the answer to the question I previously answered is basically the same, whether Adam and Eve came from ape-like ancestors or whether they were created de novo. The genetic diversity issue is the same. I'm not quite sure. So your point is bringing up the issue of common ancestry, I think, but I'm not quite following what the question is.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist, sorry. If we believe that the whole human race is descended from one couple, and that couple was physically created before any other human-like creatures were created, is that difficult to fit with evolution?
I think, going on sort of current knowledge of the fossil record, and I'm not a paleontologist, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt. It would depend where you placed them relative to the fossil record of human-like remains. And so if you were to put that couple far enough back in that sequence, then it's plausible that everything subsequently could have been descended from them. But in our current understanding of the fossil record, I believe that would take you back around 500,000 years ago or more. Obviously, that's quite hard to fit with the genealogies of the Bible if you sort of add them all up. But if you're comfortable with Adam and Eve existing about 500,000 years ago, then as far as I can see, and as I say, I don't have relevant expertise across all of these areas to be totally sure about this. As far as I can see, you wouldn't have too much problem either with the issue of genetic diversity, including, because one issue with the patterns of genetic diversity is how the genetic diversity is distributed in human populations across the globe. And so if Adam and Eve are 500,000 years ago, I think that would be compatible with our current understanding of the fossil record and our current understanding of how genetic diversity patterns change over time. Of course, science is always provisional, things do change. So I would always be cautious with any harmonization like that. I think we have to be very, very careful, both as scientists and as Christians. But that's, at the moment, that's, as far as I know, that's how things would look.
Thanks.
Question from Beth.
Okay. I was wondering if Dawkins admits to like vast amount of chance being necessary for the kind of the Darwinian process to work, particularly to do with like beginnings and
I think I've lost you all.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, but everyone is frozen on me.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, you've come alive again. Okay, it's my, and Zoom is telling me my internet connection is unstable.
Oh,
Sorry. All I heard was if something about Dawkins.
So if Dawkins admits to there being kind of vast amounts of chance necessary for the Darwinian process to kind of work, why is his view and others like it kind of so well respected in the sort of scientific world and beyond? I presume it is. So why?
Well, I think because it's the only option that doesn't invoke divine intervention. And so it's very attractive in that way. And for many people, the number one rule is no divine intervention. And in The Origin of Species, there's Darwin himself makes a throwaway comment that if you think that very complex, intricate what's it? Intricate, co-adapted things can come about in one go, Darwin says you have to invoke a miracle, and if you invoke a miracle, then you're departing from science. It's no longer science. And so if you say my number one rule is I only believe science, and science does not invoke miracles, then you don't have many options. And so the Dawkins view is the only even remotely credible view. Having said that, there is growing kickback against that view, even within the biological community. So there's a lot of biologists now who think that actually the Darwinian mechanism is inadequate. And they're very publicly looking around for alternative mechanisms. Now, most of them are trying to do that within a naturalistic framework. So they're trying to find other natural mechanisms that work instead. But so far, not very convincingly. Now, there are other mechanisms that definitely affect patterns of variation and affect adaptations. But to explain where complexity comes from in the first place, they struggle a bit because a lot of them rely on sort of going downhill in terms of complexity rather than going uphill. So there are big questions being asked by biologists at the moment, and people are less convinced by the Darwinian mechanism than perhaps they were 20 years ago. And partly this is being driven by discoveries in genomics that don't seem to fit very well with that. But at the end of the day, if God is ruled out, then any alternative will be respectable, because the idea of God is so unthinkable for many people.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, we better end with this last question here. So from Salome, when does evidence turn into belief? And I guess she means, you spoke about all the evidence for intelligent design, and that being the most persuasive conclusion. But that's not quite yet belief in God or belief in Jesus or anything like that. So yeah, how would you respond to that one, Richard?
Yeah, I think belief is something that follows the evidence, and I think faith is something that follows the evidence. I certainly don't see faith as a kind of blind leap in the dark at all. I think faith is trust, and it's a bit like in a human relationship. If you say I trust my wife, people assume that your trust of your wife fits with the evidence. If I said I trust my wife, but I have actually no evidence that forces me to trust her, that compels me to trust her, one would be insulting one's wife. If I said it, against the evidence, I trust my wife, people would say, well, you shouldn't trust her then. It is because my wife has been faithful to me over these many years, my trust in her has grown, and because I know her character and the kind of person she is, my trust grows and grows. And yes, on top of that, there might be this sort of extra level of trust that is a sort of extra leap that means you have an absolute trust. Whereas the evidence, you could always say, well, that's happened in the past, but what about the future? And in our human relationships, we can sort of get to that point where the trust becomes an absolute trust. But that's a leap that is based on the accumulation of evidence. And I think belief in God is like that. It's based on a great deal of evidence, but there can be a sort of extra leap at the end that just makes it a sort of absolute trust, just as in a human relationship. I haven't expressed that very well, but I hope that sort of makes sense.
That really does, yeah. And that trust, the Bible talks about the trustworthy deeds of the Lord and things, and that's very much what we do as a church the whole time, looking at those trustworthy deeds as revealed in the Bible. And yeah, I'd encourage anyone who's eager to kind of explore things further to join us as we do that. And that's very much what we do Sunday by Sunday and midweek. And yeah, come join in as we look at what God has said and what God has done and how trustworthy he really is. And but as Christians, we would say that ultimately that is expressed in Jesus and his life and what he said and how he makes sense of it all ultimately. So so do join us as we consider him. Well, we've just passed the 8:30 point, which is when we said we would wrap up this evening. So if you'd like to get in touch with Professor Buggs further, then he has a website and you can Google him and easily find him. So I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. But let's all give him a muted round of applause across our Zoom screens. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us and for speaking so interestingly and compellingly. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.